Poppy Playtime Chapter 2 is finally here, and let's just say it was a crazy release leading up to the crazy chapter. So up to the point of Chapter 2, Poppy Playtime had seemingly already solidified themselves as competitors to games like Bendy and the Ink Machine, even mimicking their popular chapter-based system. And similar to Bendy, after the first chapter, the game had garnered unbelievable hype for a multitude of reasons. The game was scary, the graphics were incredibly good, and overall the first chapter developed a great concept, but the only problem is just that it only was a good concept and it didn't play into the game's obvious potential very well. So with that being said, I along with millions of others were really looking forward to this new chapter's release. The only problem is after all this hype, the game would end up seeing a lot of controversy that honestly probably played a big effect on the game's performance. I won't go into all the controversy, but there was just a ton of allegations for pretty much every bad thing that can be done in video game development. There's alleged stealing, manipulation, harassment, just everything. In terms of this controversy's full effect, the developers ended up releasing multiple apology statements about these issues, and as of right now, there's been a really big divide that you'll most likely see just by looking at the comments of some of my videos. And this divide exactly is between people who forgive these actions and are okay with the game now, and there's other people who believe this game is unforgivable and should no longer be supported at all. I'm very much mixed in these aspects on multiple sides with this controversy, but in this video, it's not going to be about whether or not you should support the devs with Chapter 2, but rather if the second chapter is actually any good. And after playing through it a couple times, I can confidently say that it's really good. And in fact, you could even say it's too good for reasons I'll explain later. Follow me on Instagram and DM me there. I respond to most messages, link in the description. So basically, here's the premise of Poppy Playtime Chapter 2. When you first start the game, you're exactly where you left off in Chapter 1, and upon re-exploring the dollhouse-esque building, the door that was previously locked in the first chapter is now actually able to be opened. Upon entering this room, there's a few teases and such in terms of lore and secrets that I'll leave for MatPat to discover. And speaking of MatPat and his theories, the first character we would end up encountering in this game would be the as-predicted Poppy Playtime doll herself, as she has seemingly became friendly to the player and helps guide them through the factory. Upon doing a couple basic puzzles with the doll, we actually see Poppy herself get dragged into a hole that, upon exploring, leads us to the main room of this chapter, being the train station. Basically, from this point forward, the chapter divides into 3 separate branches or mini-games, and in all of these, there's usually a puzzle to get inside of the room, a mini-game we must end up surviving, and then there's another puzzle to actually escape the room, all of which when successfully completed granting us 3 separate clues as to how to activate the train in the train station and escape. The only problem is, throughout this chapter, we are being followed by the main antagonist named Mommy Longlegs, and we basically just have to survive everything she puts us through while she rewards us with the first 2 codes for the train. But to get the last one, we actually have to do one final puzzle in the last room where we escape Mommy Longlegs, hide from her, run from her, and eventually even trick her into accidentally shredding herself into pieces, where afterwards a spider promptly takes her head off to end the deal. Anyway, after all of this is done, we get the final code and we're able to ride the train while running into Poppy herself once again. However, also relating to many popular theories, at the end she actually reveals her real intentions to use us to help her escape, and after she says this, the chapter abruptly ends with us crashing the train, leaving a cliffhanger for Chapter 3. Anyway, the initial reception for this chapter was actually quite mixed, and the reason for this was because out of the gate there were multiple game-breaking bugs that made it almost entirely unplayable. From my experience, I noticed 2. The first game-breaking bug was a glitch that made the cart puzzle basically impossible, as the cart itself would get stuck and couldn't move. And the other game-breaking bug that was by far the most annoying was the bug that would take away all of your audio every single time you died. And for reasons I'll mention in a moment, you'll die a lot, so this was by far the worst. The moment I heard about all these bugs, I was already super disappointed, because these kinds of things cannot happen when launching a game. It's just going to ruin it. However, luckily enough, instead of taking something like a month to fix these game-breaking issues, I couldn't even finish the game before they rolled out a patch that fixed both of those problems. Now, those 2 weren't the only bugs I've noticed, but the thing about this is that these bugs are pretty few and far between besides the first couple I mentioned, and the developers were heavily encouraging everyone to report these bugs to specific people to solve them as soon as possible. And while I was at first disappointed with these bugs, especially after how well built Chapter 1 was, seeing this amount of effort being put into fixing game issues is really making me happy, because I can definitely forgive the bugs as long as they fix them, because this new chapter is so freaking big. And speaking of which, let's talk about this game's design and atmosphere, because pretty much all of these factors are done incredibly well. Every single room in this game is just so large and visually appealing, and even though we're guided down certain paths in the game, the rooms that we walk through are so massive that I'm almost overwhelmed at the amount of stuff that they put in the game. Besides all the atmospherical stuff, there's also a ton of animation animations and voice acting in this game, which is really in depth. It should come to no surprise that the animation in this game is incredibly good, and they really went through a lot to show it off. And if you were looking for a lot more in terms of gameplay from Poppy Playtime, I actually think you're 100% in the right place here. The gameplay elements of Chapter 2 in terms of puzzles are pretty solid. Most of them are still revolved around powering parts of the map, battling different physical obstacles, keeping you from turning everything on. For example, there's walls that raise whenever turning the power on and off, and there's a bunch of temporary power buttons that can only stay on for a short period. While these elements are really cool, I actually think the main treat here are the mini games put inside of the puzzles. So basically, inside of the subsections of the factory that we enter, we end up playing 3 mini games: Simon, Whack-A-Mole, and Red Light, Green Light. At first, I thought these modes were actually a little bit corny, but they are by far the best and most scary parts of the game. In Simon, the game starts off pretty normal with you being told what to memorize and then having you press the buttons after. However, as we go on, we start getting random colors and symbols to memorize, which makes the game so much harder. And while even then, Simon itself isn't really that intense of a game, what I didn't mention was that above the player is a symbol slamming toy that procedurally gets closer to you the more time you spend playing the game. And let's just say that when you get put under so much pressure as you hear the symbols grow closer and closer, it's borderline reminiscent of a saw trap, and it's done really effectively. As for the Whack-A-Mole game, it's basically just a bunch of huggy wuggies that you need to hit to keep them away. But the catch is that they are everywhere around you, and therefore you can't look at them all at once. So basically that means the game is judged by both what you can see and what you can hear. And the scariest part about this game mode is that the only distinct noise they make besides them crawling through the holes is the sound of them as they're preparing to jump scare you. And out of all the things that just make me panic in this game, this one was by far the one that did it the most. The last game that we got was a glorified Red Light, Green Light, but in this version we are running from this caterpillar and we can only move when the lights are off. This one is by far the easiest mode, but it's also the most eerie because we're forced to run while we can't see, and then forced to watch the caterpillar get closer and closer to us while the lights are on. Plus, eventually we have to run through a really claustrophobic tunnel, which is just horrifying. Overall, these mini game modes, in my opinion, make this new chapter super unique. They're fun, they're terrifying, and best of all, they are hard. What sucks so much about Chapter 1 is that while it showed off a lot of cool concepts, the game was just unbelievably easy. And while I do still think most of the second chapter is a bit on the easier side, the one exception is by far these mini games. And that's just because they take so long to beat if you're not knowing what you're doing, at least from my experience, and that just makes it all the more rewarding. So basically, this game is actually pretty damn good. But going back to what I said when I thought this game may be too good, this starts to bring in something that slightly concerns me, which is that realistically, this game did everything I was hoping for. Harder puzzles, scarier game mechanics, it's longer, it's more fun, it has a great atmosphere. And the thing is that the jump from Chapter 1 to Chapter 2 is so big that Chapter 1 now just feels more like a tutorial for the second one. And with that being said, I'm just a bit worried because how the hell is the team going to take the next big step with this game when Chapter 2 already feels borderline perfect? Like, for comparison, Poppy Playtime Chapter 2 alone absolutely shits on games like Hello Neighbor 2's beta in every single way, and that game was in development for a year and a half. And since the second chapter is honestly so good, that does give me some sort of worries for the future of this game. But realistically, most of those worries are just because I think this game is already so good that it's going to be hard to top it in the future. I know a lot of you guys watching don't support the developers, and I understand that, but like them or not, I feel like regardless, it's clear that all the animators and coders that honestly are being unnecessarily affected by all this controversy went to work with this chapter. And all these controversies with some of the owners aside, this Poppy Playtime chapter is about as good as a Poppy Playtime chapter could be in my eyes. But that's not to say I think the rollout of this game thus far was done very successfully at all. They made the first chapter entirely free, which pissed off a lot of the people who already paid for it, and they've just dropped an unreasonable amount of merch. But that's not even the end of it, because there was actually a movie announcement that was very questionable to say the least. And I talk about those things and more in this video here. Go check it out. Subscribe and peace.